How pure? This question comes to us when we look at treasures. Are they pure gold and silver? Purity in gold is defined in carats. We all know that 24 carat is pure gold. 18, 14, or 10 carat is less than pure. For these precious metals, purity matters because based on purity, their prices are determined. When we try to describe one another, the last word that comes to mind to measure each other up is purity. What would it mean to say someone is pure? Do we mean that person has no sin? Do we mean that person has never had one bad thought? Is the purity of heart different from the purity of mind? Are we talking about the same thing? White color is often seen as symbolizing purity, encompassing innocence, being pristine, and being in a state of unspoiled. This is why we see parents dressing their babies for infant baptism in white and brides wearing white dresses. This is also why we say that white clothes do not stay white when worn by busy children. In a way, we become awfully mindful of being careful when we wear white dresses or shirts ourselves. Purity in spiritual discourses is associated with cleanliness and sinlessness. This is why good Calvinists say there can be no one who is pure. Everyone is tainted and impure because sin touches us in ways we cannot even imagine. At least that idea of humanity's capacity to sin is what we Presbyterians grew up with. As Calvin's descendants, we keep this caution by referring to how easily all individuals can be dirtied or corrupted in daily struggles. We can easily make a list of ways and means by which we can do wrong things and become impure. This is why we are cautious of describing ourselves as pure Christians. If the whole humanity are so susceptible to sin, who is pure? To whom is Jesus giving this blessing? This particular beatitude seems to clarify when it narrows it down to people who are pure in heart. Jesus is definitely saying that there are people who are pure in heart. What does it mean to be ones who are pure in heart? Some scholars and preachers often like to talk about the spiritual purity of people who single-mindedly searching for God to love. They talk of mystics who abandoned worldly temptations in order to keep pure or remain sinless. Others talk about how Jesus was referring to people who kept morally and ethically pure and untainted no matter what. Interestingly, the majority of the writings on this beatitude seems to take it as an instruction to how we should be. That is, we are told by these scholars and preachers, Jesus is setting a spiritual standard by which we ought to live in order for us to see God. After all, being able to see God would be a terrific reward for all those who have been working hard in anonymity on God's behalf for their entire life without being appreciated by their peers or neighbors. According to these learned individuals, the lesson of this beatitude is, like children wearing white-colored clothes in this very dirt-prone world, we ought to keep ourselves from sin at all cost. Of course, it is very plausible that Jesus was giving a lesson for people to be morally pure. As Jews, they would have known the importance of being pure. Often, they were required to clean themselves in order to worship, and knew how priests always had to cleanse themselves in order to enter the temple to offer sacrifice. They knew too well that the high priest in Jerusalem was the only one worthy of being in God's presence from their learning. If Jews could see it that way, we could easily see how Jesus was trying to instruct his followers. However, today, we will take a different path to understanding when we hear Jesus say this blessing. We can imagine people, and within them a group of people to whom this blessing was directed. They are the ones who find encouragement as well as courage because they are being affirmed and acknowledged. They came to be part of this mass of people on that hillside sitting in front of Jesus on that day, having been ignored by others, derided, made fun of, and already dejected. They knew that being pure in heart only brought them more troubles and heavier burdens in life. They knew themselves as sinners even though they were pure in heart. They knew they were unworthy to be in God's presence. Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, and priests told them so at every turn. They knew they were poor. They knew they were powerless. They knew they were without benevolent political leaders. They knew they worked hard for living. They were under no illusion that their efforts were more than enough to fully please God. To these people, whom Jesus would call later the salt of the earth, Jesus gave the blessing. Jesus blesses those who are pure in heart. Unlike all those Pharisees and their friends, Jesus was not giving them one more assignment for them to work on, another rule to fail from. In Jesus' understanding, things were different. After all, with Jesus came God's reign. God's kingdom was realized in him. He demonstrated time and time again that through him, God's eternal reign was being realized. In this sense, this blessing was not another task for these overworked, heavily burdened, and abused people to work on. It was something that was given not only as an affirmation, but also as a gift to those who were pure in heart. It was meant for them specifically. Yes, this is why this beatitude is an affirmation and acknowledgement. It points out that there are people among us whose hearts are pure. Their effort is appreciated and accepted. Our task is to find out who these people are. Which of us are the ones Jesus is blessing? Yes, I know. To our Presbyterian ears, it is so strange to hear that there are people whose hearts are pure. We need to realize that if there were no one whose heart was pure, Jesus would not have given this blessing. That Jesus gave it tells us that there are ones among us whose hearts are pure. Throughout Christian history, there were many who tried to be seen by God and to see God. These mutual gazes, God's gaze on us and our gaze on God, are an affirmation. It validates who we are in relation to God. We are not only acknowledged, but also being made worthy of God's presence. It makes all our faithfulness and service worthwhile. Now that God's reign is being realized in Jesus, Jesus is addressing those who steadfastly kept their hearts pure. What does it mean to be pure in heart according to Jesus? Or more importantly, what distinguishes those who are pure in heart from others? In a way, Jesus and those who followed him made it far clearer. Those who are able to love God with all their heart and love their neighbors are ones whose hearts are pure. Loving God has been tied very closely to the loving of neighbors. Loving God with all their heart can be expressed in many ways. However, for Christians, the hallmark of loving God is how we love our neighbors, remembering that we are to love even the enemies. This does not mean that if people do not love their enemies, their hearts are not pure. It simply means that for some people, being pure in heart is displayed as their expression of love even to their enemies. Before we move on deeper into the current discussion, it is important to remind ourselves that loving enemies is not a test by which we measure the purity of hearts. We tend to make into a fast and binding rule that if we fail to love in certain situations, we are failures before God and that our hearts are impure. This is far from the truth. Again, this blessing is not a mandate for people to do. Rather, it is given to those who have been quietly toiling away, ignored, and forgotten. Jesus did not give these blessings so that people can be measured and be judged. Let me give an example. On July 7th, 2015, the London subway was bombed. 52 people from 9 countries were killed. One of them was Jenny, whose mother was Anglican vicar named Julie Nicholson. She mourned her daughter's death terribly. Many months later, Reverend Julie resigned from the pulpit, saying that she could not love her enemy, the one who killed her daughter. This failure to love the enemy meant that she could not lead her flock any longer in her mind. She could not meet the test to be a Christian because she failed to forgive. This was a very harsh judgment on herself. Sadly, not meeting the bar to love the enemy made her feel that she could not be a leader among Christians. This is so far from the truth. Indeed, there was this other blessing we talked about 2 Sundays ago. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. In grief and mourning are angry thoughts and the rise of many negative emotions. To mourn and grieve is not to fail. This is partly why we ought to make clear that these blessings are not the fast and binding rules. They are given as affirmation, acknowledgement, and encouragement. We know loving neighbors is difficult, especially when neighbors are the untouchables, unwanted, and outcast. Loving is extremely difficult. There is a high price associated with loving these rejected ones. Also, this love of neighbor is not necessarily tied to various charitable actions we can perform. We might think of benevolent deeds as loving neighbors. In loving neighbors, we steadfastly stay in their corner even if our neighbors are bad. However, the true love of neighbors is more than what we give or what we do for them. Loving neighbors is a state of being that we establish with those around us. In it, they feel the support from us, our acceptance of them, our willingness to share with them, our hearts being offered to them, and sharing their burdens in God's name unconditionally. It is easy for us to talk about those heroes who are able to love their enemies. In doing so, we miss the point of this blessing. Again, it is not only directed at those who have achieved the impossible, but also all those who go about being pure in heart by doing their best to love neighbors every day. For example, as many as there are not in my backyard crowds everywhere, there are compassionate people who stand with those who are kept out. These are the people whose hearts are pure. One such person is Nurse Roxy Danielson. She is a street nurse working in Toronto, reaching out to the homeless. She reaches out for the homeless even in this pandemic, trying to make their lives better. The video link, if you click it, will show you a video that tells her story. The point is that there are so many people like Roxy who work their best for the neighbors, exhausted, forgotten, and at times criticized mercilessly for working with the marginalized. These are the people who are pure in heart. Some of them are Christians, many of them are not. To these people among us, Jesus gives blessings to affirm, acknowledge, and encourage, saying, "Blessed are they, for they are pure in heart." Can you imagine how fired up they will be when they are affirmed, acknowledged, and encouraged by those who follow Christ every day and each day? As to whether the non-believers who do these work will be able to see God, of course, is not up to us. For now, in this evil-filled world, it is sufficient to receive the blessing from God and from us, the Christians who are the body of Christ in this world, with what Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are pure in heart, for they shall see God." for they will see God.